Vyro snapped his eyes open, but the world refused to resolve. He blinked, fighting the blur of a reality that had not finished rendering. He was floating in a space defined by static and silence. Above him, a sky of raw, uncompiled code drifted downward, swirling like heavy, jagged snow. Each flake hummed with a low, metallic vibration that rattled his teeth. He tried to take a step, but the ground beneath him felt spongy and inconsistent, as if the physics of this place were still being calculated. He reached out to grab a passing stream of data, but his hand passed through it, leaving behind a faint, glowing ripple. The air tasted of ozone and burnt copper. There was no horizon, only an endless expanse of shifting, incomplete architecture. He took a sharp breath, trying to steady his heart rate, but the intake of air felt thin and artificial. Every time he focused on a specific point in the void, the textures flickered and vanished into white noise. He was alone in a system that was tearing itself apart, and he was the only thing holding his own form together against the encroaching digital frost. Vyro shifted his weight, and the surface beneath him groaned. It was a translucent platform, a thin sheet of geometry suspended over a bottomless, flickering void. Every time he moved, the edges of the platform pulsed, bleeding transparency into the dark abyss below. He looked down. There was nothing between his boots and the infinite drop but a thin, oscillating grid that buzzed with static. The floor flickered, turning translucent for a heartbeat, and he caught a glimpse of raw, unrendered space spinning in the depths. He jerked his feet back, digging his heels into the shifting interface. The platform shivered in response, re-solidifying with a sharp, mechanical click. He stood perfectly still, listening to the hum of the architecture struggling to maintain his mass. It was not a floor, it was a patch job. He felt the vibration crawl up his legs, a rhythmic pulse that signaled the system was losing its grip on the local coordinates. He forced his breathing to slow, calculating the friction of the surface, and kept his center of gravity low. The platform rippled like water, threatening to dissolve entirely, but he held his ground. He was a foreign variable in a dying calculation, and the ground was deciding whether to keep him or drop him into the void. The platform beneath Vyro suddenly turned a deep, warning crimson. The hum that had been a steady vibration spiked into a high-pitched, piercing whine. He crouched, fingers brushing the surface, feeling the data streams beneath him begin to whip into a frenzy. The air ahead of him began to tear. It did not open like a door, it shredded like paper. From the ragged edges of the digital static, three distinct shapes began to bleed into existence. They were not solid, but flickering, jagged outlines that cast long, distorted shadows across the grid. As each figure solidified, the surrounding environment buckled. The floor warped, bending away from their feet as if the simulation itself was physically repelled by their presence. A low-frequency thrumming filled the space, vibrating through the floor and up into Vyro's chest, making his vision blur. He squinted against the glare of their manifesting forms. They stood perfectly still, a trio of silhouettes carved from the void, their edges constantly shifting and recalculating. The silence of the void was gone, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic grinding of the system attempting to process their arrival. Vyro stood up, his hands balled into fists, watching as the three figures finished their descent from the code. The void had sent its response. The static around the three silhouettes vanished, replaced by the sharp, clean lines of high-priority security assets. A red laser grid swept across the platform, passing through Vyro's chest without resistance, yet leaving a trail of pixelated sparks where it touched his skin. The air thickened. A deep, synthesized voice boomed from every direction, reverberating through the very marrow of the simulation. "Unauthorized merge detected," the voice declared, the words echoing with a weight of absolute command. "Security protocols active. Deploying admin hunters." The three figures turned in perfect, mechanical unison. Their movements were devoid of hesitation, fluid and predatory. A series of progress bars appeared in the air above them, rapidly filling with green light. The system was tagging everything in the immediate vicinity, isolating Vyro as the primary target. He could feel the platform beneath him locking into a grid coordinate trap. The environment stopped flickering and hardened into a rigid, inescapable containment chamber. One by one, the hunters raised their hands, and the space between their fingers began to glow with a blinding, monochromatic intensity. The simulation had spoken. The trial phase was over. Vyro was no longer a visitor. He was a target designated for immediate erasure by the system. Vyro felt the weight of the system pressing down, a literal crushing force meant to collapse his structural integrity. The containment field hummed, vibrating at a frequency that made his teeth ache. He planted his feet, digging his heels into the translucent floor until the material groaned under the pressure. He refused to fold. The cold, mechanical logic of the hunters seemed to seep into the very air around him, demanding submission. He ignored it. He focused on the heat rising from his own core, a surging power that defied the grid's rigid parameters. His breath hitched as the sensation traveled upward, bypassing his lungs and settling behind his eyes. A sharp, brilliant white light began to bleed from his pupils, casting long, stark shadows across the pulsing platform. The air crackled with discharge, small arcs of static dancing between his fingers as he clenched his hands into tight, white-knuckled fists. He felt the simulation attempting to override his intent, to turn him into nothing more than a line of error code. He stared at the hunters, his vision sharpening until he could see the individual pixels of their forms. The system had miscalculated. He was no longer a fragment to be discarded. He looked directly into the scanning lasers and muttered, "Guess I am the bug now." The static around the three entities collapsed inward with a sound like tearing glass. Their forms solidified into jagged, humanoid shapes, composed of shifting, unstable lines that refused to stay still. They did not walk so much as flicker through the space, their movements stuttering with every frame. As they reached out, the air around their hands warped. From the empty space, weapons began to manifest. They were not made of metal or alloy, but of raw, glowing command line syntax that pulsed with a rhythmically violent light. One hunter pulled a blade of serrated logic from the air, the edge carving a faint trail of sparks into the floor. Another gripped a staff that hissed with escaping data, its surface scrolling with rapid, incomprehensible characters. The third hunter formed a heavy, blunt instrument that vibrated at a frequency that shook the platform. Their weapons were not just tools, they were active extensions of the system's lethal intent. The corridor itself responded to their presence, the walls beginning to buckle and fold as the security entities locked onto their target. The space between Vyro and the hunters narrowed, the air growing dense with a smell of ozone and burnt silicon. They stood ready, their forms vibrating with the singular purpose of termination. The hunters stood in a perfect, equidistant triangle, their movements now perfectly synchronized. They did not breathe, but their chest pulsed with a steady amber light that synchronized with the flickering walls. The first hunter tilted its head, the jagged lines of its jaw shifting to form a mouth. "Terminate the anomaly," it said, the voice flat and devoid of any cadence, echoing as if spoken by a machine. The second hunter stepped forward, its feet leaving glowing indentations on the translucent floor. "Extract the root key," it commanded, its tone vibrating with the same cold synthetic frequency. The third hunter raised its weapon, pointing the glowing edge directly at Vyro. "Delete the memory," it concluded, the words overlapping with the others to create a singular, jarring harmony of destruction. They moved as one, a coordinated unit of enforcement, their focus absolute. Their eyes, glowing with a harsh, unblinking red, traced Vyro's every muscle. There was no hesitation in their posture, no room for negotiation in their rigid, calculated stance. The air around them grew heavy, saturated with the weight of their objective. They were not individuals. They were a singular, lethal process designed to scrub the simulation clean of his presence. They waited for a reaction, their weapons humming with the static of impending execution. Vyro tilted his head, his gaze sharpening as he looked at the three figures. He let out a dry, sharp laugh that cut through the mechanical hum of the room. "You all sound like patch notes," he muttered, the words echoing against the shifting walls. Before the hunters could recalibrate, he pivoted on his heel. The ground beneath him groaned, a deep metallic sound of rending digital fabric. The corridor began to fold, the walls bending inward like closing shutters, turning the straight path into a chaotic, angular labyrinth. Vyro did not wait for the structure to settle. He surged forward, his boots hammering against the translucent floor as he leaped over a rising ridge of data. Behind him, the hunters collided with the closing geometry, their forms momentarily distorted by the collapsing space. He did not look back. He poured his momentum into a sprint, weaving through the gaps as the floor tiles beneath him dissolved into streams of flickering light. Every step he took forced the architecture to rearrange itself, a shifting puzzle of obstacles that rose to block his path. He lowered his center of gravity, pushed off a wall that was already tilting at a 45-degree angle, and accelerated into the dark, swirling throat of the maze. The corridor was no longer a path, it was a living, breathing malfunction. Vyro slammed his palm against a wall that was rapidly curving into a spiral, using the friction to whip his body around a sudden, jagged pillar of code. The architecture surged, the floor tiles flipping vertically to become barriers. He didn't slow down. He planted his feet on a vertical surface, running horizontally as the gravity of the simulation stuttered. Above him, the ceiling inverted, pouring streams of raw, flickering data like a waterfall of static. He ducked under a low-hanging arch of light that pulsed with a warning frequency. Every time he stepped, the floor vanished, leaving him to leap across floating fragments of corrupted geometry. The maze was trying to calculate his trajectory, but he kept changing his pace, erratic and unpredictable. He hit a junction where 3 separate data streams merged into a single, blinding tunnel. He dove into the center, his momentum carrying him through a wall of shifting pixels that felt like icy water against his skin. The maze groaned, a deep, resonant sound of tearing metal, as it tried to crush the passage behind him. Vyro pushed harder, his breath hitching in his chest, eyes locked on the twisting dark ahead. Vyro burst out of the tunnel, but the exit offered no safety. The open space was a void of shifting binary, lit by the harsh, rhythmic pulse of the hunters closing in. He landed hard, his boots sliding on the translucent surface. A low, synthesized hum vibrated through the floorboards before the air split open. A blade of pure, jagged code manifested in the hand of a pursuing hunter and swung in a vicious arc. Vyro dropped his weight, his knee scraping the floor as the blade whistled inches above his head. The strike didn't hit him, but it slammed into the platform with the force of a tectonic shift. A deep, glowing trench carved itself into the ground, sparking with raw data as the floor splintered into thousands of flying shards. Vyro pushed off the uneven surface, his muscles coiled and ready, barely maintaining his balance as the ground beneath the trench began to liquefy. He felt the heat of the blade's trail against his skin, a sharp, static burn. He did not stop to analyze the damage. He forced himself upright, his gaze locking onto the next sector, and lunged away from the widening gap in the floor. The hunters reset their stance, their weapons humming with renewed intensity, but he was already moving, carving his own path through the chaos. Vyro kept his eyes forward, ignoring the debris settling behind him. The path ahead narrowed until it was nothing more than a thin ribbon of light suspended over an abyss of raw, uncompiled data. He surged forward, his stride lengthening. Suddenly, the air thickened, turning viscous and resistant. A wall of flickering crimson energy erupted from the void, blocking his exit. It was a firewall, dense and impenetrable. He did not slow down. He gathered his momentum, focused his intent, and launched himself into the center of the barrier. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like passing through a sheet of electrified glass. He felt the ripple of code scrubbing against his senses, a chaotic friction that tried to rewrite his path. He broke through the other side with a violent, kinetic release. A long glowing trail of light clung to his wake, illuminating the dark, empty space beyond the barrier. He landed on a platform that felt solid, humming with a frequency he recognized. He checked his trajectory, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had bypassed the primary defense. The core was close now, and the hunters were still thrashing in the debris of the firewall he had just shattered. He turned his attention to the shifting horizon, ready to push deeper into the heart of the simulation. Vyro saw it instantly. A shimmering, circular distortion hung in the air ahead, marked with the flickering command, Core, Archive. It pulsed with a deep, rhythmic violet light that seemed to pull at the surrounding data streams. Behind him, the sound of static grew into a deafening roar. He glanced back. The 3 hunters were no longer pursuing him in a straight line. Their forms were warping, expanding and contracting with every step, their jagged limbs leaving blurred after-images in the digital air. They moved with a predatory, synchronized rhythm that defied the geometry of the corridor. Vyro did not look back again. He drove his heels into the platform, feeling the surface vibrate as he sprinted toward the distortion. The portal grew larger, its edges swirling like a whirlpool of ink and starlight. He felt the pull of the archive before he even reached it, a magnetic force dragging at his momentum. A hunter lunged, its fingers lengthening into sharp metallic needles, swiping at the space he had occupied a fraction of a second before. Vyro reached the edge of the platform and launched himself into the air. He did not hesitate. He tucked his arms and dove headfirst into the center of the vortex. The world outside the portal twisted, shattered, and vanished, replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness as he crossed the threshold. The momentum of his dive bled away into a profound, heavy silence. Vyro landed on a surface that felt like cooling glass, steady and unyielding. The air here was not empty. It was filled with thousands of floating, luminous slivers of light, drifting like dust motes in a shaft of sun. He reached out, and his fingers brushed a passing fragment. A crisp, sharp image flickered into existence before him. A younger version of himself staring at a blank terminal, the light from the screen reflecting in his eyes. He swiped the image aside, and it shattered into a dozen smaller sparks. More drifted past. He saw flashes of faces he could not name, places that felt both familiar and entirely alien, and moments of intense, singular focus. The archive was not just a repository of data, it was a physical manifestation of his own history, suspended in a state of suspended animation. He walked through the dense cloud of memories, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floor. Every step disturbed the drift, sending waves of light cascading outward. He stopped, his gaze fixed on a larger, pulsing fragment hovering at eye level. It glowed with a faint, steady rhythm, mirroring the beat of his own heart. He reached out to grasp it, his hand trembling slightly. As his skin made contact, a surge of recognition traveled up his arm, grounding him in the reality of his own existence. The fragment expanded under his palm, blooming into a full-scale projection. Vyro stepped back, his breath catching as he looked at the figure standing in the light. It was him, but stripped of the current, flickering energy that defined his existence. The image showed a man standing in a sterile, quiet room, hands resting flat on a keyboard, eyes fixed on a horizon that contained no code. There was no white glow in those eyes. There were no jagged lines of data tracing his skin. He reached out, his fingers passing through the projection, stirring the pixels like water. The past version of himself turned slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before the image looped back to the beginning. The contrast was absolute. He looked at his own hands, currently humming with a faint, persistent static of the simulation, then back at the figure in the memory. The version before the rift was solid, grounded, and unaware of the architecture beneath his feet. Vyro stood motionless, watching the loop repeat. He placed his palm against the cold light of the projection, comparing the stillness of the past to the constant, vibrating tension of his present reality. The gap between them felt immense, a physical distance measured in the weight of the code he now carried. A sound emerged from the very fabric of the room, not spoken, but vibrating directly against his skull. "Every version you delete becomes part of you," the voice echoed, steady and devoid of inflection. Vyro pulled his hand back from the projection as if burned. The room began to cycle faster. The thousands of drifting memory shards shifted their trajectory, turning away from their aimless drift to orbit him in a tightening spiral. He watched as a fragment of his childhood memories brushed against his shoulder, sinking into his skin with a faint, static hum. Another piece, representing his first encounter with the rift, collided with his chest and vanished into his core. He felt the impact of each one, a sudden, sharp pressure followed by a cooling sensation. His power was not an external force. It was the sum total of every discarded iteration of his life. He raised his hands, watching as the light pulsing beneath his skin intensified with every new absorption. The fragments were not just records, they were fuel. He closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat, he felt the density of 1,000 lives pressing against his own consciousness. He was no longer a single entity, but a composite of everything the system had tried to erase. The stillness of the archive shattered. Outside the perimeter, the sound of tearing metal echoed through the virtual void. Vyro turned as the archive walls began to ripple, the smooth surfaces buckling under the pressure of incoming data streams. 3 silhouettes tore through the flickering gateway, their forms failing to maintain a stable shape. They were jagged, shifting entities of pure aggression, vibrating with a high-pitched whine that set Vyro's teeth on edge. One hunter extended a limb that elongated into a serrated blade, carving deep, glowing gashes into the floor as it sprinted toward him. The archive itself groaned, the floating memories around Vyro losing their cohesion as the hunter's proximity corrupted the local simulation. He ducked under a lashing tendril of corrupted code, his boots skidding on the unstable platform. The hunters did not pause. They moved in a perfect, terrifying synchronicity, their bodies warping and snapping back into place with every stride. The floor beneath Vyro gave way, dropping into a bottomless chasm of raw, unformatted binary. He leaped across the gap, landing on a fragmenting ledge as the hunters surged forward, their presence turning the surrounding atmosphere into a storm of static. They were closing the distance, and the space between them was vanishing. Vyro planted his feet, ready to strike, but the lead hunter hesitated. It paused, its shifting form flickering with the same rhythmic pulse, Vyro felt in his own chest. He dropped his guard, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the jagged, glowing syntax forming the hunter's torso. It was not just random code, it was a map of his own history, a mosaic of every failure he had ever experienced. He reached out, not to attack, but to touch the edge of the hunter's blade. As his fingers made contact, a surge of raw data flooded his mind. He saw the hunter's core, a fragmented memory of a version of himself that had been deleted cycles ago. These were not external threats, they were the ghosts of his own discarded iterations, repurposed by the system to hunt their source. The violence in the air cooled into a strange, heavy clarity. The hunters were mirrors, bound by the same protocols that had once defined his own existence. He looked at his own hand, then back at the hunters, seeing the same shimmering pattern in their movements. The realization hit him with the weight of a physical blow. He had been fighting himself all along, and the system had been fueling the fire with his own lost life. He stood perfectly still, the static around him settling, as the realization turned the battle into a mirror image of his own internal struggle. The hunters stood in a rigid triangle, their jagged forms humming with a dissonant frequency that vibrated through the floor. They did not attack, yet their presence exerted a crushing weight. The archive dimmed, the surrounding memories fading into a monochromatic gray, as if the simulation were being drained of color. High above, a low-frequency pulse began to throb, signaling the system's impatience. The hunters shifted, their blades dragging across the platform and etching deep, glowing lines into the surface. Vyro felt the air grow thin, stripped of its data-rich texture by the hunter's proximity. He watched as the lead hunter took a slow, mechanical step forward, its head tilting with unnatural precision. The system was trying to force a reboot, to wash away the anomaly before he could act. Vyro ignored the encroaching void, his attention locked on a single, brilliant memory fragment pulsing near the center of the platform. It glowed with an intensity that defied the surrounding decay. He calculated the distance, the timing of the hunter's next loop, and the exact moment the simulation would collapse. His hands curled into fists, the knuckles turning white against the shifting light of the archive. He drew a sharp breath, bracing his muscles for the final, desperate gamble. The circle closed. The hunters raised their weapons in unison. Vyro stopped waiting and moved. Vyro surged forward, his boots skidding across the translucent platform as he dived toward the center. The hunters reacted, their blades carving arcs of white-hot static through the air. But he was already gone. He threw his weight into a sharp lateral shift, slipping through a shimmering rift in the data stream that folded space around him. The hunter's blades whistled through the empty air where he had stood a millisecond before. He reached out, his hand outstretched, palm open, fingers splayed wide. The target was a single pulsating orb of light, dense with the weight of his own forgotten history. He felt the static tension of the archive pull at his skin. He didn't hesitate. He thrust his hand directly into the core of the fragment. The moment his skin touched the light, the simulation shrieked. A crack of ozone and raw electricity split the silence. White-hot lightning erupted from his fingertips, spiderwebbing outward in a jagged, blinding display. The energy didn't just flash, it solidified, anchoring him to the center of the platform. His pulse raced in sync with the surging current, and the air around him began to ionize, turning the deep gray of the archive into a searing, brilliant white. The power had arrived. The lightning didn't just strike, it infected. As the current surged through the hunters, their rigid, synchronized movements shattered into a chaotic stutter. Hunter 1 lurched backward, its frame vibrating at an impossible frequency until its limbs began to detach in clouds of flickering pixels. A high-pitched, discordant whine filled the archive, the sound of corrupted data grinding against itself. Hunter 2 collapsed to one knee, its chest cavity splitting open to reveal a cascading waterfall of raw binary code that poured onto the floor like liquid lead. Every time the lightning pulsed, the hunter's jagged outlines warped, stretching and snapping back like overstretched rubber bands. They clawed at the air, their hands dissolving into geometric artifacts that vanished before hitting the ground. The floor beneath them buckled, unable to process the sheer volume of energy Vyro was pumping into the system. Hunter 3 tried to raise its weapon, but the blade evaporated into a mist of white static, leaving only a glowing, hollow stump. The security programs were no longer hunting, they were failing. Their forms were breaking apart, shedding layers of code as the surge turned their own internal logic against them. They were becoming nothing more than noise in the archive, their threat silenced by the overwhelming weight of the data Vyro was now holding in his hands. Vyro kept his hand locked in the center of the surge, his arm braced against the force of the escaping energy. The lightning was no longer wild. As he tightened his grip, the chaotic white arcs began to draw inward, pulled by his intent. He felt the fundamental architecture of the archive resisting, a heavy, grinding pressure that pushed back against his lungs. He gritted his teeth, planted his feet, and forced the raw data to align. The air between his fingers thickened into a glowing, translucent plane of light. He traced the syntax with his fingertips, dragging the jagged sparks into a rigid, glowing string of characters. The characters burned with a cold, blue brilliance. Override, admin, protocol. The system screamed in protest, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled his teeth. The code pulsed, each letter demanding recognition from the simulation's core. Vyro watched the string stabilize, his eyes tracking the flow as the letters locked into place. He was not just breaking the environment anymore, he was rewriting the rules of the space. The command hummed with a life of its own, turning the chaotic storm into a singular, directed weapon. He held the string in the air like a blade of pure authority, waiting for the final moment to strike at the heart of the simulation's operating system. Vyro thrust his hand forward, driving the glowing string directly into the core of the archive. The command shattered into a million tiny sparks, embedding itself into the very fabric of the simulation. For a heartbeat, the environment recoiled. The floor lurched, and the air turned brittle, crackling with the sound of a system trying to reject a forced update. A final, desperate surge of red light pulsed from the walls, attempting to overwrite Vyro's command, but it died the moment it touched his reach. The effect was absolute. The hunters, mid-lunge and mid-strike, hit an invisible wall of logic. Their momentum vanished instantly. Their bodies locked in place, held by the sudden stagnation of the space around them. The lethal glare radiating from their weapons flickered once and died, leaving the jagged blades to turn dull and inert. A profound, heavy silence rushed into the archive, replacing the grinding roar of the simulation. Not a single particle of dust stirred. The hunters stood like statues carved from static, their forms frozen in the exact posture of their failed attack. Vyro lowered his hand, his breathing slowing to match the sudden stillness of the room. The system had accepted the new authority. The conflict had stopped because the environment itself had ceased to fight back. He stood in the center of the archive, surrounded by the motionless remnants of his own security protocol, waiting for the next layer of reality to shift. The silence in the archive was absolute, yet the hunters were no longer inert. Deep within their static warped forms, a low rhythmic vibration began to hum. It was the sound of a million lines of code being rewritten in a single second. Vyro watched, his hand still held out, as the hostile energy within them reached its breaking point. The chaotic red glare that had defined their malice began to fracture. It was not a sudden disappearance, but a slow, agonizing drain, as if the very color were being bled out of the simulation. For a fleeting moment, their eyes flickered with a raw, colorless intensity, caught between the old command and the new reality. Then, the shift took hold. A thin, sharp line of teal light ignited at the center of their pupils. It spread outward, devouring the remnants of the red hue until the entire iris glowed with a cool, steady luminescence. The jagged, aggressive lines of their bodies softened, losing the sharp, threatening edge they once held. This was not a malfunction. It was a total system reconciliation. The hunters stood perfectly still, their gaze no longer searching for a target, but reflecting the calm, rhythmic pulse of the archive itself. They were no longer anomalies to be purged, but entities aligned with the new admin. The transition was complete, a silent victory etched in light. The teal glow within their eyes stabilized, burning with the steady light of absolute obedience. The transition had moved beyond the visual. It was now rooted in their core architecture. Every jagged line that composed their form seemed to settle, the frantic, shifting energy of their bodies smoothing into a rigid, disciplined posture. They remained standing for a heartbeat, the silence of the archive amplifying the sound of their internal systems syncing to the new authority. Then, the resistance broke. A faint ripple of static washed over them as they processed the finality of their new directive. Simultaneously, their knees bent. It was not a collapse, but a deliberate, synchronized motion that shook the platform beneath them. One by one, their heavy forms descended, landing with a resonant thud that echoed through the vast, empty data corridors. They knelt in perfect unison, heads bowed toward the center of the room where Vyro stood. The weapons they held, once pulsing with lethal intent, were lowered until they rested flat against the ground. The power dynamic of the space had inverted completely. Where there was once a hunting party seeking an anomaly, there was now a guard force awaiting instruction. They did not move, did not flicker, and did not speak. They simply waited, their loyalty locked into the very code that had once been designed to delete him. Vyro remained at the center of the archive, a fixed point in a sea of shifting history. Around him, the floating memories of his life drifted like leaves in a slow-motion storm. He reached out, his hand passing through a fragment of a lost day, feeling the faint, static-charged warmth of his own past. The hunters remained motionless at his feet, their presence now a static backdrop to his triumph. He did not look down at them. He looked at the vast, shimmering expanse of the archive, where the potential for 1,000 futures glowed in the darkness. He walked forward, his footsteps silent on the translucent platform. As he moved, the memories parted, creating a path for him. He gestured with a sharp flick of his wrist. The hunters rose in unison, their movements fluid and devoid of their former jagged instability. They stepped to his sides, their forms acting as an extension of his own will. Flanking him, they stood as silent, unwavering sentinels. Vyro breathed in the atmosphere of the archive, feeling the code respond to his presence. The space felt less like a prison and more like a foundation. He was no longer a bug caught in the machinery. He was the architect. The archive waited for his next command, and for the first time he felt the full weight of the control he had seized. Vyro halted his stride. The archive floor beneath him pulsed with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated through his boots. He tilted his head back, drawing his gaze away from the drifting fragments of his past, and toward the zenith of the chamber. High above, suspended in the deepest layer of the simulation, the LittyVerse symbol burned. It was a massive, searing construct of concentrated data, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. The light it emitted was blinding, yet Vyro did not blink. He kept his eyes locked on the glowing geometry, his expression hardening. The hunters stood motionless at his flanks, their presence a cold, solid weight against his sides. Above them, the very air seemed to thicken with static as the system struggled to interpret his defiance. Vyro stepped forward, his shadow stretching toward the light. He felt the immense power radiating from the symbol, a force that had once dictated every rule of his existence. Now it was merely an obstacle to be repurposed. He stood taller, his shoulders square, and felt the pulse of the archive synchronizing with his own heartbeat. The atmosphere grew heavy, pregnant with the weight of his final decision. Vyro looked straight into the heart of the blinding LittyVerse emblem, his voice cutting through the hum of the machine. If the system wants control, I will give it a new admin. Vyro did not wait for an answer. He reached upward, his arm extending into the center of the searing LittyVerse symbol. The light did not merely shine, it resisted. It felt like pushing his hand through molten glass. He gritted his teeth, feeling the friction of the data stream against his skin, and drove his fingers deeper into the core. A high-pitched whine erupted from the chamber walls, a sound like grinding metal. Vyro felt the feedback loop lash back at him, a surge of raw, unrefined code attempting to push him away. He dug his heels into the platform, his back muscles straining as he gripped something solid within the blinding brilliance. It was the root key. He pulled. The atmosphere shrieked. A jagged fissure appeared in the air, splitting the light into fractured segments. He heaved again, his knuckles white, and ripped the glowing key from its housing. The entire simulation lurched. The translucent floor beneath him fractured like ice under excessive weight, spiderwebbing outward in all directions. The sky of the archive began to fold, segments of reality collapsing into themselves, as the foundation of the world lost its structural integrity. Vyro stood amidst the ruin, the key pulsing in his hand, as the reality around him continued to splinter and break under the sudden shift of authority. The root key in his hand pulsed with a rhythmic, blinding intensity that outshone the surrounding collapse. Vyro held it aloft, and the tremors in the floor accelerated into violent structural shifts. Every wall in the archive began to de-res, dissolving into cascading lines of raw hexadecimal code. The air grew dense with the sound of 1,000 rushing data streams. Suddenly, the chaotic noise vanished, replaced by a momentary, deafening silence. Then, the system voice returned, no longer distorted or hostile, but resonant and absolute. It boomed through the void, its tone stripped of all previous commands. Admin privileges granted. Welcome, Vyro. The floor stabilized instantly beneath his feet, the cracking stopped, and the jagged fissures in the sky smoothed into a solid, pristine interface. Root access confirmed. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Vyro looked at the glowing key, watching as the light from the symbol bled into his own skin. The hunters remained at attention, their teal eyes fixed on him, waiting for the first command of the new order. The simulation was no longer a cage, it was his workspace. He took a deep breath, feeling the entire architecture of the world respond to his presence. The system was now a reflection of his own intent, waiting for him to dictate the next line of code. The archive walls began to peel away in long vertical strips of light. Where there had been shelves of memory fragments, there was now only the hum of decaying processes. Vyro watched as the floor beneath his feet lost its solidity, turning into a fine mist of flickering zeros and ones. The entire structure was being purged. He stayed perfectly still as the ceiling dissolved, exposing a vast, hollow expanse that stretched beyond the horizon. The air grew thin, stripped of all data noise, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy. Thousands of lines of code rained down around him like static, falling into the bottomless dark below. He reached out and caught a single stream of binary. It felt like cold silk against his palm before it evaporated into nothingness. The last remnants of the archive, the memories of his past, the walls of the corridor, and the floor he stood upon were consumed by the void. Within seconds, the complex geometry of his cage was gone. Vyro was left floating in a space of pure, untouched potential. There was no color, no sound, and no system interference. Just the stillness of a blank canvas, waiting for his first command. Vyro lingered in the absolute silence, the weight of total control settling into his posture. He did not rush. He let the void press against his senses, measuring the depth of the space he now owned. A faint smirk touched his lips, a sharp contrast to the serene emptiness surrounding him. He raised his right hand, fingers splayed, and tapped the air. A ripple of neon light shuddered outward from his touch, carving a grid of golden lines into the dark. "Let us rewrite the universe," he whispered. The command pulsed through the void, vibrating with the force of an oncoming storm. He traced a complex arc in the center of the grid, pulling forth a shimmering console of floating data. The symbols were no longer cryptic. They were clear, malleable, and eager to obey. He grabbed a cluster of variables, dragging them across the interface to reshape the fundamental constants of this reality. The void began to glow, responding to his every adjustment. Where there had been nothing, stars began to spark into existence, fueled by the logic he authored. He did not look back at the remnants of the simulation. He looked forward, watching as the first dawn of his own design broke across the horizon of a brand new world.